Hello, everyone. I'm here with the world-renowned investigating journalist Donal Macintyre. Thank you for joining SlavConf.
Delighted. Thanks for having me.
So my first question is, and I think we're going to be very serious here. So, what do you think? Why, or is it a true statement that people stop respecting journalists?
Well, I think that is a broad statement, and I think it has to be broken down. I think journalism is a very big word for a lot of what we read and see and what is communicated today. But I think what's interesting, as citizen journalism broke out with technology over the last a decade and a half, then that has challenged the view of what journalism is, what it can be. And I'm a great fan of citizen journalism and the citizen interpreting and delivering and putting their story or their recordings on stream. But I think as much as people now question that, particularly now when this has now developed into social media, comment, abuse, trolling, I think people, because one end of communication on social media and journalism has lost a lot of respect, and because the name journalism encapsulates that, I think although that has damaged the word and the profession, I do think that quality journalism and well-researched journalism, on the other hand, has benefited because people now see the difference between poor journalism or social media or commentary or citizen journalism and robust kind of quality journalism like the New York Times, the BBC, Reuters. This is journalism which basically comes with consideration and values and heritage. So while the word journalism encapsulates everything today, from social media, communications, trolling, I do think that quality journalism will win out. And how do we know that? Well, we know that people are paying for the Guardian, they're paying for the Times, they're paying for quality journalism, and they're appreciating it. So they're not, so in the way that they passively absorb Facebook trolls, social media commentary, everybody is a commentator these days, and that's fine. It's called democracy. But I do think that although there is some concern over journalism, I think quality journalism wins out still to this day.
So can we explain the wording citizen journalism? Why is it so important right now?
Well, I think there is, particularly around the world where democracy is not as strong or is absent. We've seen in Tunisia and around the world, and in Myanmar, we've seen the citizen journalists recording and reporting the news as they see it in the here and now. And the citizen journalist, their take on events and live reportage, often live streaming it, is very effective, and equally as effective as you might say a live reporter on the scene. But of course, the citizen journalist is there, he's on the street, this is news happening, unfolding in front of them. A news desk will obviously be called, and then a crew will be dispatched, and then that's a different layer. But to have that immediacy, and I think it's important. I think it's important to be able to recognize the benefits and the wonderful joy and access that the citizen has to tell their own story without censorship. On the other hand, I think it's useful to have professional journalists on the ground who are mediated and who are trained, who understand objectivity, they understand the pressures they are, and they understand the imperative to tell the truth. And they also understand issues like, in terms of not causing offense and being aware of their wider role in the community. And so I think the citizen journalist, as I say, he's not trained, he's not a professional, he doesn't perhaps even get a wage. So I think, but they are at the scene and they're happy to tell their stories on Twitter or on any other social media platform.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about the not paying the journalists and how they even train to be corresponders of
Well,
information?
how? Well, I think the wonderful thing about journalism and is that, and I think it is the case in most countries, though not all countries. The wonderful thing is that there's no real qualification to call yourself a journalist. This is not a profession which requires a degree. It doesn't require you to be able to spell. It doesn't require you to be able to particularly write well or communicate. So, but people find their niche in this broad spectrum we call journalism. You might be an expert in canoeing, and you might be a sports journalist. You might be a person who's an expert in crochet, and you're communicating that. And you might be a travel journalist, a political journalist. My specific sphere is investigative journalist, and a lot of the people who I know, who work with me, who I've worked with, some never did a degree. Some certainly never studied journalism. Often, many of them studied history and politics. And people come into journalism through a multiplicity of different ways, and they come at different stages. You can have a 14-year-old journalist who can do a cracking job on a story. You can have somebody who decides they have a story they want to tell and become journalists in their 60s and 70s. And it's a porous, open profession. And so in terms of training to be a correspondent, well, I mean, the realities of training to be a correspondent is that it's different complexities. But I think the real celebration of journalism is that there are no particular obstacles to telling your story, particularly today in social media. In terms of getting a job in a mainstream organization, I mean, my path into journalism was I was started out. I did sports journalism, I did financial journalism, but in the end, and found my way into investigative journalism, both in newspapers and television, and it was a pretty traditional route, local newspapers and magazines, newspapers, and then broadcasting. So and then you make the most of your opportunities. But as I say, the bigger point here is that is the great thing about journalists is that it isn't a protected profession. You're a journalist. You can just say, I'm a journalist, and you are one. And whether somebody buys your story, great. If they don't, or else you put it out online. So and I think that's important for democracy.
Yeah, it's all about information. And how do you manage to create a brand for yourself? And I think the main issue is fact checking. And how did you manage to organize your facts, to organize the information that you present to the people, to the audience?
Well, I think I mean, the word brand is a kind of difficult one in journalism because nobody says, "Oh, I want to be a brand." What happens is that broadcasters want to use presenters or reporters, and they want to celebrate their journalism, so they advertise it, and other people call it a brand. But in the end of the day, it is for me, as it always was, is that you get a good story. You dig, you meet people, you talk to them, you research it, and you check and you counter check. I mean, there is a sense that there's never any sense of presumed knowledge, but I think fact checking is it's important that we get the basics right. And I think the problem is a lot of with journalists who aren't trained is they don't understand that Wikipedia isn't an authentic source that you should rely upon for information, but our online sources are, they don't understand necessarily papers of record. They don't understand necessarily, where one should go to actually corroborate, or that you should corroborate your facts from a multiple of sources if that's appropriate. So the fact checking, it's basic. You set a proposition and then you try and get somebody to prove it or disprove it.
Okay, you mentioned that the journalism and the journalists are not it's not a safe profession, and you must able to to think of somehow defend yourself, and in relation to investigating journalism, how did you manage to do that? Where to start?
Well, I think, I mean, any investigative journalist worth their salt is going to be the target of legal actions, protestations, and they're going to, and sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. And in a democracy and where there's legal action, you're held to account for what you do and what you don't. And, but I think, you just, you try and hold true to your journalism, and you just, the best of journalists will make mistakes. Sometimes they get it wrong. You take it on the chin. But by and large, you just try and be authentic and fair and rational. And I think journalism and investigative journalism, particularly in the UK and Ireland, and in Europe, it's in a pretty robust shape. There are many. There are safety nets. There are gatekeepers. So it's not just, if I want to broadcast a show or even produce a newspaper article, it's going to go through, I'm going to be the chief gatekeeper with my experience. It's going to go through an editor. It's going to go through a lawyer. It will go through maybe somebody in editorial compliance if there are other issues, external issues, ethical issues involved. So journalism, in terms of organizations, it's a mediated profession. I just don't decide and go on a rant and libel anybody. What I say has to go through all these various gatekeepers, these checks and balances, and that's the way it is. And that differentiates obviously from social media, where there's no checks and there's no balances, and it's just, or the citizen journalists where there's limited checks and limited balances. So I think it's not for me to, obviously in terms of fact checking, in terms of protecting myself, in terms of legal or reputational jeopardy. Journalists, when you're, you can't make an omelette, they always said, without breaking eggs. And so inevitably, investigative journalists who are always kind of seeking to take on difficult subjects are going to be attacked. And that's part of the profession. It's an occupational hazard. So I think you need to be resilient as a personality. And I've been fortunate. I've been, doing investigative journalism for more than 25 years now. And, I'm still grateful that people, want to hear what I got to say. They want to see my programs or my pieces or I either produce, direct or report or present or write. And I think longevity, I think is a reasonable barometer of the time you've taken to try and fact check and to do good stories and do them well and fairly.
Have you ever been in danger?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I've been in war zones. I've been in Beirut during the Troubles in the early 90s. I've been in Sarajevo. I've been in the Congo, and I've been in Myanmar, and reported from those locations. I've been shot at. I've been mortared, attacked, but I've been very lucky that I haven't been in those situations. I've been in Mexico during the drug wars, but I'm very lucky in those situations where nothing happened specifically to me or to anybody in my crew. So there's a certain kind of, I suppose, confidence that gives you, but there's an unrealness about that in the sense that you are not, if somebody close to you isn't killed or murdered or maimed, then I think that gives you a kind of, it protects you. It gives you a kind of an extra layer of confidence, which allows you to be a little, to present as confident. Often if you're in a war zone, if you present as being scared, then you will make mistakes. So I think, and when we're in those positions, we obviously have advice. We might have bodyguards, but we would do and be trained specifically for some of those places we go into. In relation to some of the undercover work I've done, which was particularly in the first decade of this century, in the noughties, a lot of the undercover work I did was dangerous because by its very nature, you know, there's no bodyguards nearby. You're by yourself. You're with dangerous people, people who could kill, who might kill if they believed you to be an infiltrator or undercover or a journalist. They would be more concerned if I was law enforcement, and it's always it was a surprise to these people that, oh my God, you're a journalist. You know, I expected, you know, customs and excise, police, but not a journalist undercover. And certainly I got numerous death threats over the years, and there was lots of safe houses. But that again was a slight occupational hazard. That's not the issue now. You know, I have since gone on to make programs with one or two of the people, and you know, in one particular case with a major drug dealer who I went undercover with for over a year and exposed him as a drug dealer, and I kind of was instrumental in him getting some jail time. And he threatened to kill my life, but we now have reconnected. We've done a program since, and yeah, he's given up crime, and we get on quite well now. So, you know, I think investigative journalists can carry, you know, an ethical dangers. It can carry moral dangers, legal dangers, reputational dangers, and also in some instances it can carry physical threats. But mostly that was most acute for me when I was undercover.
And how did you overcome this situation mentally? Can you talk about this?
Sure. I mean, my brother and sister are both doctorates in psychology. I've always been aware and attuned to the fact that, you know, that being undercover, particularly, you know, it's a very unusual and place to be. You're living someone else's life. In the case of my big series, Macintyre Undercover, I was working in 4 or 5 different roles undercover at the same time. I was a football hooligan, I was a fashion photographer, I was a care worker, I was a bodyguard, and we did a couple of other projects at the same time. But effectively, I would go from a fashion show photographing Naomi Campbell to a football hooligan event to a care home, literally within 2 days. And that was so unusual. In many ways, changing those roles each day to day was a rest. But after that big stint, I did go and I did, you know, get a psychological debrief just to make sure that my mental health was good and proportional, and I was happy that it was. And at the BBC, I did instigate protocols, and also at World in Action, which is no longer with us, but I did protocols in respect of the mental health and safety and counselling for those journalists who are undercover, because it's important, you know, that there is a health and safety matrix around, you know, people who, you know, either do war reporting or who do undercover, because you know, although it's very exciting, you know, some people might need more support than others.
What do you think, which is the main problem, the main issue in journalism nowadays? What needs to be changed?
Well, I think it's you know, I think it is in reasonable shape. I think so. I think there's a great deal of more. Here is the landscape. There is more money on investigative journalism. There's more money now being spent on news. There is more outlets, and I think the quality of journalism and news journalism, investigative journalism, is better than ever before. So that's the landscape. I do think the real problem is that we have to try and alleviate and moderate the abuse of the social media platforms to create false news, false narratives, to become, you know, so to allow people to be able to differentiate from prejudiced material. And but I think in terms of the quality of the journalism, I think and mainstream journalism investigations, you can go from Discovery Plus to National Geographic to Sky to BBC to ITV to Channel 4 to Channel 5, and you will see solid investigative strands. And you know, simply there is more investigative output today of a much better quality than ever before. On the other hand, there is with social media, more fake news, false news, bias commentary, and commentary and material out there designed to I think to manipulate and to play with the worst prejudices of ourselves. So basically, they tend to mine our own prejudices and opinions. And I think that's the real danger. But in terms of investigative journalism, I think I've always said the sky isn't falling in on investigative journalism. There is more money, there is more finance, I mean, in the international sphere anyway, and more outputs and more demand. And the audience wants to hear quality, professional, objective journalism, and we know they're willing to pay for it.
Yeah, definitely. So, do you remember your first internship as a journalist?
Well, my first stuff I did, my first journalism was as a sports journalist, and I was reporting on local, what they call Gaelic football matches in Ireland, and Gaelic football is the national sport in Ireland. And so I would just be sent, I would hitch 20, 30 miles to an inter-county football game, and it would be, these games were so minor that the papers wouldn't send anybody to cover them specifically, but I would be a local stringer who would cover some of the sporting stuff. So I would cover some of the sporting events. They were very insignificant, and sometimes you'd even arrive late for a game, and you'd have to go and in retrospect write up, and you'd only be writing up 2 or 3 paragraphs, but for you that would feel like you've just won the Pulitzer when you got it published, and then you get, after a while, you start doing some you start working for magazines, and you get your articles published, and you get a byline, and then later on you get a photographic byline, and then you get a job as a reporter on TV. So initially journalism on your internship, it is undoubtedly ego driven, and some of the best journalists who've done some of the best work, some of them, their work has been driven not because they're ethical or they're morally driven as a journalist, but because they're ego driven, and they know that if they expose this, that's going to be their reputation, and they're going to be considered as more important. They're going to be considered and earn more money. But sometimes, usually in the life stream of a journalist, you're ego driven, you're young, you're driven, you want to make your reputation, you want people to think you're an approval junkie. In the end, when you grow up a bit in your 30s and 40s, you recognize actually the work that you do, you want to make a difference. And obviously journalists have to pay the bills like anybody else, but you want to make a difference, and you choose those subjects that you think are important and that are relevant to you. So I think there is a trajectory, and we must acknowledge that journalists are ego driven, they're selfish, they'll be narcissistic, they want to be famous, but sometimes that is a driving engine for them to do good stories, robust stories, and important stories, even if their own personal motivation may come from a very selfish and narcissistic perspective. But I think most investigative journalists of long standing kind of break through that ego stuff and just want to do good stories and important stories. And I think that's where I am at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's the best way to ask you a follow-up. So can you give any advice to any person that want to become an investigating journalist?
Well, I think concentrate in those areas well, be resilient, be confident, always fact check, and understand that there, before you decide on your own perspective on a story, do try and take a command of the field and kind of recognize all the alternative perspectives. But lots of reading, lots of research, and lots of resilience. And remember, there's no qualifications to be a journalist. Declare yourself to be a journalist, but I think you do try and be fair, objective, and rational. And it's a great profession, and I think, but I think after a while, you do need to believe in the stories that you're covering. It's not essential, but I think, if you're going to want a long career, you have to believe in the stories that you cover and that matter to you.
What kind of projects are you working right now? What kind of interviews, maybe?
Well, I'm working on a feature doc about Giovanni Di Stefano, formerly known as the Devil's Advocate, who was an Italian lawyer who represented Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, and many of the world's most notorious gangsters, dictators, despots. And then eventually he's still now in prison at the moment because he was convicted for being a lawyer without any qualification. So I'm working with Jim Sheridan, who's a 6-time Oscar-nominated director. We're working with him on that project, and that's in the development phase. I've just finished a series, Murder in the Cottage, with Sky, working with Jim, and I was the producer of that. That was a long-term project, and I'm just working in a series for CBS called Release to Kill, which is about how some offenders are released from prison and then go on to, and are released from prison once and twice, and then go on to kill 2 or 3 times after they've been released to prison. So it's a series called Release to Kill. So basically, yeah, I'm a busy boy.
Great. Thank you for joining our conference, our 5th anniversary, and everyone, stay put. Thank you. That's all from me here with Donal Macintyre.
Thank you very much. Have a great conference.